So we'll be talking about coal seam gas today. I'm pretty excited to see so many people coming to the university. It's a science talk, and we don't see that many people coming for science talks all the time. So here's an outline of our presentation. First, the motivation, the background, and then we're going to address those three questions. The first question, groundwater, surface water exchange. That's my main expertise. Second question, does coal seam gas exploration release methane to creeks and rivers? Third question, is coal seam gas potentially a source of a greenhouse gas to the atmosphere? And finally, you're going to set the scene for the future. You're going to set our research agenda. We don't have a final answer for any of those questions. We only have preliminary data, but we do believe that those preliminary observations we have made are going to push the debate forward. So I always tell my students that asking questions may be more important than finding answers sometimes. So I'm going to start by posing this question here. If you're mining for uranium, which would be the first chemical you'd be looking at? If you're mining for methane, I believe that's the first chemical we have to look at. The coal seam gas debate seems to focus on keywords like chemical waste, toxic waste, and so on. All of that is very important, we need to look at, but we are mining for methane. That's what you got to look at first. The table over there is from a government website. We have a list of a bunch of chemicals that I can barely pronounce. All of them are important, but this table has been designed for conventional groundwater exploration. We are not talking about conventional groundwater anymore. That's a new industry. So you got to change the way we are looking at groundwater chemistry. And I think methane is a key element. Why is methane important? The plot over there is showing a time series of methane concentrations since in the last 1,000 years. So some very hard-working scientists, they took samples from ice cores in Antarctica, and they were able to take concentrations from the air bubbles from the ice core. So what we see over there is a sharp increase. So methane concentrations in the atmosphere have doubled in the last 100 or 200 years. What's important about methane is that it's a very powerful greenhouse gas. So if you look at the 100 years time scale, methane is about 25-fold more powerful than carbon dioxide. If you look at a 20 years time scale, methane can be 100 times more powerful. So that's a powerful greenhouse gas. You got to look at that. Where is all of that stuff coming from? Since the Industrial Revolution, methane sources to the global environment are mostly anthropogenic. We humans are pumping methane into the atmosphere. It's coming from coal, oil, and gas industries, cattle, rice, and a series of other minor sources. The natural sources are only about 40%. So the pie chart over there is showing the contribution of all of those sources. The issue about that plot is, I think it's outdated. That's 5 or 10 years old. The coal and gas industry is growing very quickly. We don't have new information about those sources after this major increase in unconventional gas exploration. So we have to update this information. We need to understand where this greenhouse gas is coming from if we are able to make good climate predictions. So one of the reasons that is driving our research is technology. Last year, we got a grant from the Australian Research Council to buy new instrumentation. You see the title of the project over there. It was for studying greenhouse gas cycling in coastal environments. Very powerful, the first one in Australia, and as far as we know, it's still the only one. That's our main focus, coastal waters. And when you look at the community crying out for research, we just thought we could move inland a little bit and start working in creeks, rivers, and the atmosphere. So what makes this instrumentation so special, it's over there, is that this is portable. We can just put that machine in a car or on a small boat and go for a drive. And you're going to get high precision, high resolution observations. So we're able to take a reading every second while driving a car. It's much easier to do that than go out there, fill up bottles, fill up airbags, and bring those bags back to the lab and spend days running them. So we're much more effective today. Why is coal seam gas expanding so quickly? The short answer is that we are running out of the conventional fuel sources. We like to pick the low-hanging fruit. Coal seam gas is unconventional. It's much harder to go down there and mine coal seam gas. Technology is driving coal seam gas expansion everywhere. The first one is horizontal drilling. We are now able to drill horizontal wells. So just expands the area where the gas can flow into the well. The plot over there is showing a series of Australian wells. So the vertical scale here, a few hundred meters, going from the surface down to 700 meters. If you look at the horizontal scale, it goes up to 2.5 Ks. So that's a huge area where the gas can flow into the well. On top of that, we have fracking, the very controversial fracking. Fracking creates vertical conduits along that horizontal well. Those conduits, they are usually 10 to 50 meters long, at least in the US. We don't really know in Australia. That's the rough average in the US. But can be up to 500 meters. So in the worst case scenario, if that's a 500 meters conduit, we can potentially have these conduits going from the horizontal section of the well all the way to the surface. We don't know if that's happening, but that's possible. Don't have any data demonstrating that yet. So our approach here has been, let's go to Queensland. They are much farther than New South Wales on this coal seam gas business. So I tried to go to Queensland to get insights into how to design good scientific experiments here in our backyard. So I will simplify and I'll just refer to Queensland as Tara. That's a township over there, and there is a series of wells nearby. It's a full-speed coal seam gas production field that is going to grow much more in the next few years. Lots of infrastructure, compression stations, pipelines, all over the place. Lower population densities and drier weather. So very different than here. We have a bit more people here, more water. They don't have that much water over there. And here we are still at the exploration stage. We don't have any major infrastructure yet. What's available so far? Why do we have to do research on that? There is very little. This is a new report that just came out a few weeks ago, in October. That's publicly available. The goal of this report is to provide an overview of key management issues. I can't see any bias in this report, very well written. The main conclusion is that they make a case for more research. But to me, the punchline is that there is no data. Another major report, new one, this one is from August. So this report is specifically about greenhouse gases, whether coal seam gas emissions are properly accounted for. So the goal here is to review the literature. It's a desktop study. Nobody has gone out there to take samples. The conclusion is that there is no information about methane emissions in this country. And the methods to assess those emissions are no good. The conclusion again, no data. Let's come local now. This is a report to Groundwater. This is old. This is 1 year old. That's another desktop study. The goal, identify the groundwater use and constraints. That's available on the net. You can see that. There is one line about coal seam gas in the conclusions of the report. And you can read, coal seam gas are present, and we need to consider that. My interpretation of this report is that coal seam gas was just an afterthought. So I don't really know how coal seam gas is interacting with our groundwaters here. Now, what I find interesting is that the title of this report has the word future. And we don't have a single methane concentration data point in our basin here. I would hope somebody out there can show me that information. I have struggled to find it. I can't find it. Maybe it's hiding somewhere, but I just can't find. We don't have groundwater level observations for this region. I would hope to see that. So if anybody out there has seen those time series of groundwater level, please show us. We need to see that. All right, so we're going to start talking about our first question, groundwater surface water exchange. I'm focused on this exchange because here we drink river water. We drink surface water in this region. So groundwater is a major issue, but most of our resources are really surface waters. Those are a few quotes from a government website. We have, in the past, managed groundwater and surface water as independent, and we have had problems because of that. Another quote, we need to manage groundwater and surface water as a single resource. What happens is that it's not simple to define what's groundwater and what's surface water. You have a drop of river water, it's moving downstream. That river water can go into the ground, and now it's groundwater. And the same drop may just come up downstream. So it's going in and out all the time. And that's why groundwater surface water exchange is important. We need to look into that. So I'm going to talk about a few very simple hydrological concepts. You see the plot over there? That's a gaining stream. The groundwater level is higher than the creek level. So groundwater, of course, is going to flow downstream, downhill. If the creek level is higher than the groundwater level, the creek water is going to infiltrate into the ground. So we have a losing stream. Finally, if the groundwater level is just too low, we have a disconnected stream. We're going to have lots of infiltration from the creek into the ground, and the water is going to be lost. We need to classify our creeks. We need to understand which one of our creeks in these regions are gaining, losing, or disconnected. We don't know that. Another simple hydrological concept, any textbook shows that. That's the cone of depression. Imagine you're pumping groundwater. You're going to lower the water table. You have this funny shape over here near your well. If you're not pumping too much, you still have your gaining stream. The water table level is still higher than the creek. If you have a second well, of course, you're going to lower the water table even further. And now we may have a losing stream. If you have a series of wells and you have horizontal drilling and your goal is to lower the water table, we may have a disconnected stream. So I hate trying to exaggerate, but this plot is inspired in Queensland. We have seen reports in Tara, near Tara, of the groundwater level going down by 100 meters. I personally don't believe it's possible here, because if the groundwater level goes down 100 meters, we're going to have seawater replacing that groundwater. We are closer to the coast. So that's the worst case scenario. We don't have any clear, or we don't have any studies demonstrating this is happening, but those are the questions you should be asking. That's how we should be designing experiments to look into that. Now, if you have a cone of depression, what do we need to do to understand what's going on over there? It's very simple. We have to install a series of monitoring wells. So for every location where we are going to potentially lower the water table, you got to monitor that. So we can understand the shape of the cone of depression. How high? How wide? Is this going to impact our creeks, farmers, whoever? The issue here is that monitoring wells, just like coastal gas wells, they're expensive. We here, we don't have a drilling school, unfortunately. We don't have a drill rig. We don't have trucks to do that. What's surprising to me is that in New South Wales, as far as I know, there isn't a single groundwater monitoring well that has been designed, put in place to look into coastal gas. I understand the government has released $3 million to drill wells. They're coming, but they're not in the ground yet. We have hundreds of monitoring wells in the States, but not because of coastal gas. They have been there for 20 years to do other things. We have a bunch of other groundwater problems everywhere. So our approach here has been to go around the problem. We are unable to drill holes, or deep ones. So we are looking at the surface. We are using natural geochemical tracers to look at the surface and try to figure out what's happening underground. So that's one of our tracers here, radon. So radon traces any water or gas that's moving underground. So this gas is natural. It's everywhere. It's produced by soils. Soils have very minor amounts of uranium. And uranium just decays away and becomes radon eventually. Because radon is very soluble, it's a gas, as opposed to uranium, it can just move with the air or the water. As a result, radon is often, or always, much higher in groundwater than surface water. And that's much higher in soil gas than the atmosphere here. Radon is radioactive. So as soon as that gas leaves the soil and gets here, there is no source of radon here. It just disappears in a few days. As a result, groundwater is often the only important source of radon to creeks. And we have very good technology today to look into radon. We are very good at that, quick, easy, and precise. I'll show you a radon data set. That's the Tuchan swamp in our catchment. This is a map of radon concentrations. You can see you have a high radon concentration somewhere here. You have low radon concentrations in this region here. And we have higher again here. So essentially, we are mapping where the groundwater is entering the creek. If the only information I have is this one, and somebody wants to drill coal seam gas in this catchment, I would be telling them, drill your well here, because groundwater is not feeding these creeks, as long as you don't have a horizontal hole that's going all the way to the other creek. So we can do that in a few days. That's not too hard, so we can do that. And we can understand and start classifying those creeks into gaining, losing, or disconnected. So that's a pH map. The Tuchan swamp is a coastal acid sulfate soil catchment. Some parts of that swamp have very low pH, which is bad for fish. What's interesting here is that we have this region of high radon, low pH. That's a coastal acid sulfate soil hotspot. So we have groundwater with low pH seeping into the creek. And we have this creek. We have high radon, so that's groundwater fed. But the pH is just fine. So in this case, we don't have a link between surface water quality and groundwater seepage. Sometimes groundwater is good for the creeks, most times. And sometimes you have the contaminated groundwater that can be a problem. So we can use this sort of approach to classify creeks and start learning about how they function. This map was produced by one of our students doing an integrated third-year project. It's a 3-month student project. So you see the yellow pins. You see Lismore somewhere here, Casino over here, and you see the yellow pins. They are coal seam gas wells exploration in the grounds. They are there. So my student has taken samples from 5 creeks. That's the location of her samples. So she was taking radon samples across the catchments to try to gain some insights about how those creeks, behave hydrologically. That's a very simple summary of her results. She found radon in those 5 creeks. I'm pretty sure many of you know a few of those creeks. Over here. So if those creeks were losing creeks or disconnected, radon concentration should be approaching 0, close to this red line. But no, those creeks are being fed by groundwater. So we have very high radon concentrations in those creeks, of those creeks. So we're starting to classify those. And I think that's the kind of information we need to get if you're able to understand what's going to happen after major developments. Now I'm going to move into methane again. So our talk today is about radon, methane, and carbon dioxide. This is one of the few studies looking into methane, in this case in shale gas in the US. What these people have done was to take a series of methane samples across the landscape in groundwater. And here they are plotting the concentrations of methane versus the distance to shale gas wells. Lots of scatter. Methane is natural. It's very hard to find out whether a given concentration is driven by gas or it's just there. It's possible. So the conclusions here is that the concentrations, on average, they were much higher close to the shale gas wells. They were able to fingerprint the methane source to shale gas. So they were interpreting that as evidence for a gas flow across the aquifers underground. And again, we don't have a single methane concentration in our basin. This study was very controversial. They had a hard time linking those concentrations to coal seam gas. And the reason for that is that they didn't take a sample before any major developments. So that's what we have in Australia, I think, anecdotal evidence. That's a movie that has been around. Many of us here have seen that before. Those are bubbles in the Condamine River. Looks like a spa bath, right? So methane is coming out of this river. We have more evidence. We have the Gasland movie. So we have this lady here burning her tap. So there is gas coming from her tap, fire coming out of there. I think you got to take samples. You got to take samples and figure out where that stuff is coming from. And the $1 million question, is this natural or is this driven by the coal seam gas expansion in the basin? We've got to ask those questions. Now, more anecdotal evidence. This is a slide from a coal seam gas mining company. They are showing that in this region in Queensland, there are a series of farmer wells that are just bubbling methane. You can see those bubbles over here. And look at this artesian well, just splashing water and gas. So it's possible, it can be natural. We have natural seeps in many locations everywhere. What can we do about that? I think you got to do baseline studies. So I'm going to start showing some of our results. This is a survey colleagues of mine have done along the Richmond River. So we're driving a boat. Here's Damien and his instrumentation from Bellona all the way upstream to Lismore. So we see the color codes, the concentrations are going up and down. There is nothing unusual about our Richmond River here. You have high concentrations in Lismore, really just because it's freshwater. I haven't heard about reports of bubbles in the Richmond River. And if we do hear about those reports, now we have some data. We can compare before and after. Hopefully, you're just not going to hear about those reports. Now, can you remember this number? 226. That was the highest concentration of methane we have found in this river. It was near Lismore. As far as we know, that's the first study to design an experiment in a river before any major potential changes. So this is the Condamine River, the bubble sites. We had students over there taking samples. We have been there. Here are the concentrations. Here are the bubbles, 0. And we took samples from the water along the river, upstream of the bubbles, and downstream. Of course, the concentrations are going up and down. Upstream, much lower concentrations of methane. And downstream, you have some methane still there. We're able to do some fingerprinting of that methane, and the composition of that methane is identical to coal seam gas. It's not a question. It's the same methane that we're extracting. If you look at the lowest concentrations we have found along the Condamine over here, we can compare that to the Richmond River. So the lowest concentrations from those few samples in the Condamine, they were 10 times higher than the highest concentration in the Richmond River. So what that means? Honestly, not much. Again, the same question, are those natural seeps? Or are those bubbles driven by coal seam gas? We don't have an answer for that question, unfortunately. And the reason for that is that we didn't take a single sample before those bubbles came up. We need to do baseline studies anywhere we have any sort of major economic development. So what do we need to do here? This is a very simple experiment that I believe should be guiding us along this journey through coal seam gas. Here I'm plotting the concentrations of methane versus time. So what we need to do is to understand the natural variability. You've got to figure out the ups and downs before any major developments. We take quite a few samples and we look at that over time. Then we start coal seam gas or anything. You've got to intensify our sampling at the beginning of any major developments. If nothing is happening, looking good, you can slow down, take fewer samples. You start saving resources. But you keep monitoring over time. But if things are looking bad, if concentrations are going up, now we're able to nail a source. We can understand what's happening. So first step would be, oops, methane is going up. Now let's look at all the other chemicals we can think of. Let's do the whole periodic table. If that keeps going up, if that's too high, we stop the industry, right? That's how it should work. So when I look at this plot, it looks very simple, but I haven't seen one of those before. And I think if you don't do baseline studies, we are going to fail the history tests. Every time I look at these plots, I keep wondering, I don't have units for time here. Coal seam gas is growing quick. Where are we along this axis? Are we here? Are we here? Or we are here? I wish I had an answer, I don't. Hopefully Damien has some.